All right, everybody, let's get started. It's Wednesday, it's 12 o'clock. That means it's time for the Lunchtime Discovery Series. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the show. Thanks for logging in. Thanks for tuning in and joining us here on the program today. Hope that wherever you're watching us from today, you are missing out on some of this severe weather stuff that seems to be moving across the entire state of North Carolina. So thanks for tuning in. Stay safe out there. All right. We're doing it virtual today. Well, it kind of works out, right? We weren't asking anybody to drive to the museum and all of this, but also because today's guest isn't actually all that close to Raleigh, North Carolina. That's a fantastic thing about the technology these days is that we can bring people from all over the world into our program. Now, before we get started, I always have to make sure that I mention the Lunchtime Discovery Series is brought to you by the folks in the Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality. They work very hard every single week to find really cool and interesting people to bring into this program that we get to meet, hear from, gain insights, share stories. You, viewers, have the opportunity to ask questions. And we get to learn something new, which is my favorite part of the Lunchtime Discovery Series. And then, of course, we broadcast it out of the Museum of Natural Sciences here in downtown Raleigh. My name is Chris. I'm your host, but I'm not very important in all of this. The person that is important today is our guest speaker. Now, today's guest speaker, I think, is going to be talking about something that is very near and dear to my heart, museums. How about that? One of my favorite things, museums and science. Although, listen, I work at a natural history museum, natural sciences museum, right? And so I'm not totally sure about the humanities and the STEM. No, I'm kidding. I'm sure that these two things go hand in hand. In fact, I know that they do. And so I'm very excited for today's guest and for what we can learn. Everybody, let me introduce you to Terri White. Terri is the president and CEO of the Charlotte Museum of History and has a background working in lots of different museum settings, including such distinguished places as the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Let's see here, the Heinz History Center and the Carnegie Science Center. So I think this is going to be a good one. Terri, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, everybody, tuning in. This is something that I'm really passionate about and really excited to chat with you all about. So hopefully this is a good lunchtime hour for everyone.
I think it's going to be great. I mean, just some of the things we were talking about, backstage before getting started, you sharing some of the experiences, and even just hearing about your site, the Charlotte Museum of History. Yeah, this sounds like a good one. I'm ready for it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You ready for me to click the button?
Let me check the chat real quick. Yeah, they're ready. Let's get into it.
Okay. All righty. So again, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Terri White. I am president and CEO of the Charlotte Museum of History in the Queen City of Charlotte, North Carolina. It was pretty rainy and monsoony out here earlier today, but now the sun is out. I guess even weather wanted to hear what I had to say, so I'm going to claim that. And I'm going to talk about the hidden, or probably more accurately described, uh, taken for granted connections between STEM and the humanities. It's something that to this day, I've worked in museums for well over a decade. People still think that working at a museum means you get your ID badge and you get to just walk around the building looking at paintings or dinosaur bones or, mummies, and that's your day. And it's always interesting to have to remind people that in order to get those public programs, those exhibits, those events, there was a lot of behind the scenes work to create these experiences for the public that sadly doesn't involve just looking around. And this topic, I hope and think everyone on the call will find interesting as some of that background work and why museums matter, not just for their sake as museums, but as important centers for STEM education and STEM employment in America. So I think it went. Oh, hold on. There we go. So Chris talked a little bit about me. I just wanted to again just kind of give an overview of my background. Before I worked in museums, I actually worked in finance at a bank that no longer exists. It was Chevy Chase Bank. Um, for anyone familiar with Washington, D.C., if you got off at Metro Center Station, blue and orange lines, my branch of Chevy Chase Bank was right there. And it's back when interest rates, I could still say, oh, yeah, 7% interest rate on a savings account, insane things that just don't even exist anymore. And we hit the recession of some time ago. And I realized, I don't like my career progress being based on the financial situations of others. It was just not a fulfilling thing for me that it didn't matter how hard I worked. The economy at the time just wasn't going to have me have a successful career. So I said to myself, what would I do for free if I could and get a job in that field? And the first thing that came to mind to me was museums. I was always the kid excited about the third grade field trip to go see the mummies. Oh, we're going to the conservatory to see all the plants. I loved it. And my first, very, very first museum experience while I was still working in finance was the National Geographic Museum in DC. It's a very small museum, mostly photography exhibits, but at the time they had this really immersive exhibit about whales. And to this day, I know more random facts about whales than probably the average person. But that in turn, that volunteer experience parlayed into a job at the National Air and Space Museum with the Smithsonian. I was headquartered at the National Mall location, but twice a week went out to the Udvar-Hazy Center, and I was one of the visitor services managers. So the distinction between the National Mall location and Udvar-Hazy is a little easy to kind of point out. National Mall is Night at the Museum, and Udvar-Hazy Center is Transformers. So if you've seen those two movies, you've seen the two ends of one institution. And I fell in love with military history, aviation history. I had a lot of veterans that were volunteering at the museums all the way going back to World War II, who would give us tales of their experiences. And it was just a really great experience for me, not only professionally, but personally, to get close to this field. Fast forward, I went home to take care of my grandmother, and I ended up at the Heinz History Center. Heinz History Center is the largest history museum in Pennsylvania. It was recently named for the second year in a row the #1 history museum in America, so good for them. They're #1 for now. Charlotte Museum of History will come for that title. And it is a 4 museum system in Pittsburgh that covers history, sports, uh, military history in Western Pennsylvania, as well as some natural history and anthropology out at the Meadowcroft site. Got a promotion and went to the Carnegie Science Center, busiest museum in Pittsburgh. It is a science museum that is always swarming with children, touching things and learning. And it was a really cool place to be sitting and typing on your computer. And then you hear thousands of children screaming with delight. So, really nice experience. And my last museum prior to coming to North Carolina was really Phipps Conservatory. I was there just for a brief stint while I was working on my MBA, but that is one of America's oldest botanical gardens and conservatories. And that structure is award winning. It dates back to the 1800s. So it was a great final museum experience before I got here to North Carolina. So, long-winded answer just to kind of give some context as to why STEM and museums is important to me. The vast majority of my museum experience has been in STEM and STEM adjacent places. Our overview for our talk today is that we're going to go over the usual suspects. When you think STEM and museum, these are probably the institutions that you think of. But the known unknowns is where I really want to spend a lot of time and focus on. What parts of this industry do we not know of, or do we just take for granted that are connected to the arts, humanities, and cultural institutions like museums. And then also the future. How is technology impacting the future of our institutions? And how are we using these tools to make sure we're maximizing our impact in our communities and on society? So, like I said, oh, none of my graphics are working. We have 350 planetariums, 487 science centers, 323 natural history museums, more than 200 air and space museums, 384 zoos and aquariums, and more than 1,000 botanical gardens and arboretums. So I was looking at these stats because when you think of science museums, these are the main categories that you think of. You think planetariums, of course, astronomy, science centers, go and learn about, the human body and, some basic robotics and things like that. I don't know a kid who has not seen a dinosaur in a museum before. That's for natural history spaces where you can learn about geology and fossils and things like that. Air and space museums, growing up and wanting to be an astronaut or seeing Snoopy on his little biplane, those inspire a lot of imagination in kids. And these sound like the main places where you would want to focus your STEM energy in the museum category. It just makes sense. And that little last line was supposed to come in last, so that's my poor PowerPoint skills. Apologies. And that all sounds great until you realize, oh, did it change on the screen? Here we go. Science-based museums only account for about 5.8% of all American museums. Now, this graph here is from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. It is a little out of date, but we can assume that not too much has changed in the proportions of these ratios. That 5.8% includes arboretums, the natural history and natural science museums, science and technology museums, and all of our zoos. By and large, historical societies and historical homes make up the vast majority of American museums. History museums are the largest museum type. Now, this unclassified and general museums, I dug a little deeper into that, and that's where it kind of gets a little murky. It includes 165 maritime museums, battleship museums, military museums, armory museums, 176 music museums, 29 food museums, 127 sports museums, and all sorts of quirky one-off places that really make American museums a fun industry to be a part of. I'll say for my friends in North Carolina that we are home to some really quirky places. There is a tuba museum that is on my bucket list. Every time I try to get to this tuba museum, something comes up. But that museum, as cool and quirky as it would be for me, would fall under that unclassified or general museum category. You could also think of the National Mustard Museum in Wisconsin, also a fun place I've been to. The World of Coca-Cola, as commercialized as that may feel, that is a museum dedicated to the history of that company. So again, I show this graphic to say that STEM and museums is a natural relationship, but not necessarily in the way that one might think, because our science and science adjacent friends make up a small percentage of the industry. We love them. We love you guys, but they are the small guys in the pool. So for our history museums, what is it that we're using technology for? And I will apologize. I'm going to primarily talk about history museums because that's my day today. But this also applies to art museums. It applies to our quirky friends like the Tuba Museum. It applies to library and archives. The humanities is a very vast array of institutions that I'm a little biased to focus on history museums. So please take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But in our upper left corner, we have art conservation. That is a straight up and down chemistry degree. You need to understand how chemicals can lift dirt and grime and years of neglect and pollution from a painting without disturbing the artwork underneath. That also goes for artifacts that we find that are, buried underground. How do you get the dirt off of them without accidentally rinsing away a finish or some special erosion that actually adds to the character of the artifact? That's just straight up chemistry. There's no way around it. And it's one of the more low hanging fruit kind of duh moments when you think about STEM and museums. But if you go over to the lower left corner, we have a gentleman here. I think that's Thomas Jefferson. We'll call him Thomas Jefferson for today. 3D printing has become a major part of American museums. Now, when I first started in museums, 3D printing was still so new that it was just prohibitively expensive to incorporate it into our day to day work. But since that was 100 years ago, 3D printing has become much more affordable. And so, what are some ways that we're using this? Um, on a sort of fun way, there are many museums who use 3D printing to replicate objects and artifacts that they either can't get access to, have repatriated back to their home countries, or that are too fragile, delicate, rare, etc., to travel to be displayed. Uh, I saw this most recently in Louisiana, where there was this whole ancient Egyptian uh, exhibit and about how Egyptian art can be seen in other artistic influences. Well, they did not get King Tut's actual mask from Egypt to bring here. It was a 3D printed version of his sarcophagus to show the parallels between the ancient Egyptian art and the different art styles that they were referencing. This allows people who don't have the privilege to travel and see other cultures and other countries for themselves to still learn and experience about those cultures without stealing or keeping stolen objects from those peoples. It also, the British Museum does a really cool program where they have a list of their artifacts that if you just really love this statue or you really love this one fixture, you can 3D print your own copy of it. So it's a revenues driving source for them where people get a tchotchke that's pretty unique and connects them to something that they had this spiritual connection to in their museum without having to steal a priceless object from a museum. Um, on a more practical matter, 3D printing is awesome for accessibility of spaces and objects for people who have low or no vision or have physical challenges that makes it difficult to get into some of our historic homes or into spaces that were built before modern ADA laws. One example of this from the National Air and Space Museum that was one of the earliest programs that I've seen doing this. We had our top 10 huge aircraft and spacecraft that people love. The Enola Gay, the space shuttle, Amelia Earhart's plane, not the one she got lost in, which is a question that came up quite a bit, a different plane of Amelia Earhart's, et cetera, et cetera. These are huge objects that people who have fully functioning sight take for granted. You can look and see, oh, this thing is big, it's shiny, it's silver, it's red. But if you aren't able to see that, those aren't really great descriptors. Oh, it's big. Okay, well, is big a car? Is big an elephant? Is big a McMansion? What does that mean? So what we were able to do is 3D print hand-sized versions of those aircraft so that you get the shape of the object and then walk them around the perimeter of the aircraft while going through the history and describing what you're seeing. And it allowed people who weren't able to see it the way those of us with standard vision would experience those objects for themselves. Same thing for some of the smaller pieces that I'm sure you've been to exhibits where there are thousands of doodads in a case. Well, if you can't see the case, what does that mean for you? 3D printing allows people to hold and touch these things for themselves. I'm getting a little long with it. I'm just really excited about this. Um, in the upper right corner, you see someone holding an iPad on some really interesting straps. What they're doing, and this is actually something we're working on here at the Charlotte Museum of History, iPad and gaming technology really helps create immersive spaces for people to see a space the way it would have looked at any given time period. So, for example, in the picture, they're looking at a very sterile, well preserved hallway, but that iPad is giving them the power to see what it would have looked like in its active days. What we're working on at Charlotte Museum of History, we have a diorama from the 70s that depicts our main downtown intersection in 1775. Well, it's very hard to conceptualize what does an urban core look like 250 years ago. With this iPad technology, we're able to show people you're looking at 1775 on the diorama. Here's where Bank of America Stadium is in comparison to this diorama. Here's where, the Wells Fargo office building is compared to, this horse pen on the diorama. And it really helps kind of help people connect the past to the present. And then finally, and again, these are things, and just a sample of things that we're currently using technology for in history spaces, reading cursive. And I didn't think in my life that that would be a special skill that we might need artificial intelligence to help us do. But as fewer people are able to read and write in cursive, we have millions of historic documents that are going to need to be transcribed and translated. Many of you may have seen how the National Archives recently put out a call for volunteers. Hey, we need people who can read cursive in order to translate these. But what do you do for the ones that are just so faded or the handwriting is so unique that the human eye can't really figure out what it's saying? That is where scanning technology and artificial intelligence comes in, so that these voices and these words coming directly from the first source can be preserved for future generations. Oh, went the wrong way. There we go. But here's some ways that we're moving forward in technology. Now, on the left, you have this lady. She has on some kind of funky glasses. She's looking at a very virtual looking space. Uh, when you take AI and you go to that next level, you're able to create AI immersive experiences for people. So you don't just see what it would have looked like at that time. You get to walk through the Alamo during the Alamo, not just imagine, oh, there be some people walking around here. You get to walk amongst them and interact with people who were at certain time periods. Um, it's also being used to bring voice to famous people in history. If you take all of the writings of, say, Frederick Douglass and a bunch of pictures of him, you can put those into an artificial intelligence program and create Frederick Douglass that the public can then interact with. Now, that's the more controversial way of using it. And I'll get to that in a second. But that is something that a lot of institutions are doing, taking the words of someone. One good example was the Cowgirl Museum in, where was that? Was that Texas? That was it? In Texas, National Cowgirl Museum, they had an exhibit about Annie Oakley. And throughout the exhibit, you could talk or at least watch Annie Oakley talk about that time period in her life. That's done through technology. Um, I'll say that another thing that this kind of watching people how they go through the exhibit, if you've heard of RFID, radio frequency IDs, a lot of retail stores use that to see where are people going in their stores so they can put the most expensive items in places where people go the most. Museums are using this technology to curate your experience while you're in there. So the British Museum, for all intents and purposes, is pretty innovative in this space. They're able to change some of their display signs and digital monitors based on where you've already been within their space. So if I'm someone, I'm just really into uh, Cubist paintings, right? Cubism. If I wander into an ancient Egyptian section of there, they can digitally create experiences for me while I'm walking by to connect Cubism to ancient Egypt, or to make that connection to make my experience unique to me and a personalized, curated experience. There are also museums that are doing fully virtual exhibits. Sometimes exhibits are very expensive to put together. Let me just tell you guys, if you think a couple $1,000s gives you an exhibit, no. Let me pop that bubble for you. A basic panel exhibit with some really cool objects that meets all of the museum standards is 5 figures at least. When you start getting into the more immersive spaces with dramatic lighting and rare objects or things that you have interacted with, you're looking at 6 figures or more. And some of the more permanent exhibits, I know the Oakland Museum of Art, they have a permanent exhibit about Californian history. 20 years ago, that was the $5 million exhibit. So these are not cheap things to put on. However, a virtual exhibit is much more cost effective, and technology, through scanning objects from around the world, allows you to bring objects together to tell stories that otherwise just may not be possible because of cost factors. I have this photo up here of the young lady taking a selfie with David. One way that museums are kind of trying to stay hip and with the times are creating selfie spots throughout their galleries to encourage younger people to interact with their spaces and put their information on the internet. So using technology and filters, instead of just, oh, look at this statue, or look at me standing next to the statue, me and the statue could be taking our selfies together. So this is a more fun way that I see things like filters being used, but I wanted to share that there are lots of cool ways to kind of interact. And then the bottom right one, my sciencey friends will appreciate. There are STEM museums working to bring extinct species back to life. Now, excuse me, I have the woolly mammoth here because, I'm not a scientist, but I think a woolly mammoth wouldn't be such a terrible idea. Maybe not Jurassic Park, but these are things that museums are actively working on using technology and their collections to help society as a whole. So, but there are some downsides to this. Um, One of the main things is sometimes a museum just has to be a museum. We are inundated with screens on our computers, our phones, the stores. If I'm in a museum that's using RFID technology to curate my experience, what if I just kind of want to be in a quiet corner and contemplate? Sometimes you can get what's called digital fatigue. And whereas historically museums have been very anti-digital spaces to be within, incorporating too much of this technology actually can exacerbate this issue. Excuse me. Additionally, what many museums have found is that people don't have the same focus on digital screens and digital interactions the way they did with real objects or even replica objects. When something is just a bunch of pixels, people don't interact with it the same way they would with a real life thing. Um, Another issue, and this came up within Charlotte Museum of History, when you use AI, especially, but when you use too much technology, what is the real authentic voice of the story you're trying to tell? To use my example of Frederick Douglass, you can take all of his writings and all of his pictures and create this AI Frederick Douglass, but it's still not Frederick Douglass. And so, what happens when that AI vastly misinterprets something that he would have stood for, that we as historians would know this is what Frederick Douglass stood for, but the AI gets it wrong? And for most people, what they see in a museum, museums have very high trust factors. They're going to walk away with that wrong information thinking that it's fact. So I have the two Spider-Mans pointing at each other. In my mind, it was, well, I am the original authentic story versus the technology aided and enhanced one. What is the true story that this object or this person or this exhibit is trying to display? But also in the bottom left corner, you see a bunch of old technology. It breaks my heart to see some of it because I definitely interacted with some of those pieces. Technology is changing so quickly. The money that you save on doing that virtual exhibit or making an interactive panel will quickly be spent just on upgrades, maintenance, and trying to make sure that you get the latest things in there. I'll share two really quick comments. One, people are hard on museum fixtures. Anyone who works in a museum will tell you if you put it out there for people to touch, be prepared to have at least 10 more in stock because I don't know what you guys do when you come in museums, but it is a lot. So we don't want to take away that textile experience or tactile, excuse me, experience, but it is expensive to keep replacing objects. The same is true with technology. When I was in fifth grade, the Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh were putting in this Inuit exhibit. And at the time, a computer and an exhibit, wow, that's top of the line. Well, 2 years ago, I went and this computer was still there. And it was the lamest digital interaction I have seen in a while. So just in within a lifetime, something went from wow, cutting edge to why do you still have this here? This just doesn't even work. So those are some of the downsides. Additionally, in addition to our internal use of STEM and our internal concerns about STEM, we have external factors as well. In our upper left, here in North Carolina, especially our friends to the west, flooding impacts historic institutions. The Asheville community, 80% of the structures in that heavily tourism driven area were impacted by the floods there. Many museums had to close. Those who didn't have to close have damages in their collections. And if you think getting rid of mold in a home is difficult, a collection of priceless artifacts or paper documents, it's even more work. In addition, in the lower left, the LA fires, more than 1,000 historic structures were destroyed during the LA fires from earlier this year. And on the right, we have such issues as global terrorism. You see a historic statue of Buddha now gone because it was destroyed by the Taliban. Now, the sad part is that these are issues that plague our industry, especially in the history space. One I didn't share because I don't know if someone from the MoMA is on here, but even the Museum of Modern Art in New York has been, has gotten flack for tearing down historic structures to expand their space. How much history are we losing to urban development, global terrorism, climate change, and things of that nature? On one hand, we as museums have the responsibility to document this and to talk about what climate change is and how these cultural clashes are impacting not just our sites, but humanity. But it's also the STEM fields who can help save it. When we talk about the flooding in North Carolina, I know that one of the things that we're talking about is, well, one, let's make sure all the people are okay, but how can we preserve the artifacts or the sites that have been damaged? With the LA fires, can we rebuild some of the restructures? For the ancient artifacts that have been lost through terrorism or urban development for the historic structures, what about 3D printing? Can we recreate objects that may not be the originals, but offer that experience to people? And I'll stop here and just say thank you all for chatting with me because I definitely want to leave room for questions. But I want to just summarize to say that if you have ever been nervous that, oh, your kid tells you, I want to work at a library or I want to work in a museum, I want to go into art, I want to go to theater. Don't be afraid that they are going to be poor the rest of their lives. They may not be millionaires, but there are plenty of STEM related positions within our industry that help us function. I'll also say one thing that I didn't get into because, again, I cut a lot out because if you can't tell, I'm really jazzed about this. The humanities humanize science. When you look at technology that doesn't read skin color well because it hasn't been tested on people of all hues, or you think about the environmental effects of where we decide to build the things we do, what communities are impacted by this. Museums, libraries, archives of all types help tell those stories so that the people who are out in the world making the cutting edge decisions on how we can live within our environment can understand the human story behind every decision we make. And so, with that, I hope that I've shed just a little bit of light. If somebody wants some references, feel free to email me and I can send you links to dissertations, journal reports, articles that really deep dive into technology use in museums and how museums influence technology in society. But I really want to hear from you guys. I'd love to talk more. And thank you for joining me.
Well, everybody, jump into the chat and let's share our appreciation because Terri, this was fantastic. Lovely presentation, fantastic
Thank
stuff.
you.
I mean, it was so fun. It was so much fun to kind of like track these thoughts and insights that you were sharing about STEM and technology and more in museums, kind of like alongside your personal trajectory, like through Carnegie
Yes.
and through the different places that you've worked to, right? Like the way that those experience have influenced the work that you're doing now in Charlotte and how you think about uh, science or technologies and the various ways that they get applied across the entire museum sector. I will say you totally caught me off guard with that science and science adjacent museums represent less than 6% of the nation's museum segment. That blew my
Yes.
mind.
So, fun fact I learned last week. You may not recognize that because we're here in, the Tar Heel State. North Carolina has more science museums per capita than any other state. I learned that last week. And so here, you guys are all over the place, but collectively, it's okay. There's room for all of us. I love it.
There's absolutely. I did not know that either. That is amazing.
Mhm.
That's incredible. No wonder I'm here. No wonder I like it around here. So, I'll remind everybody who's all of our viewers, if you've got questions or experiences, insights that you want to share, comments, you can drop those into the chat on YouTube. I've got that pulled up right now so that I can see what everybody's talking about and share your questions over here with Terri. So make sure that, as you download the presentation into your brains right now, when questions come up, go ahead and drop them in the chat because we've got a lot of time for that. One that has come up, Terri, do you have any ideas on how science and history museums in North Carolina can collaborate or build partnerships?
Absolutely. And I'll say it's something that we are actively working on at Charlotte Museum of History. So I'll give some examples, but to answer the question, yes. So here at the museum, we have a 18th century spring house, the refrigerator of the 1700s. But over 250 years, the stream that historically ran through the spring house to make it a spring house has shifted. And now we're barely getting a trickle, but we don't know why. Is it just 250 years and the water shifted, or is there some environmental factor behind it? So we've been working with geology students at UNC Charlotte to kind of test the waters, make sure that there's nothing, dangerous in there, especially with mold, because now we're getting mold inside of the building. So they tested that, and they brought in students and we're trying to figure out what can we do to save this structure that has an ecological purpose but also is telling a portion of the history. Additionally, when we do building restoration work, we we have our historic Salome School. the way it looks today is as close to how it would have looked in 1924 as we could get. We were able to work with paint historians and scientists to not just get down into the grains of the wood and figure out what was the original paint color, but how do you replicate the paint from 100 years ago? And so scientists and science museum people were able to help us with that process. So I think there's absolutely room for collaboration. It's a matter of finding the crossroads, not just between the story, but how you want to present that story to the public.
Excellent stuff. Something I think about, and that I think lots of museum professionals or even just museum adjacent professions, like even like just across the education sector, for example, in general, I think is this conversation about how much technology is the right amount of technology, how much uh, how much STEM should there be in your humanities? Maybe is a maybe that's a way to phrase it. I don't know. That might be too much. But uh, like you were talking about the difference between seeing a printed label or exhibit panel versus a digital one, or getting
Right.
screen fatigue. How does someone designing, curating, or working, or how does a team of people come together? How do you think about those decisions on when to pull in those elements and when to intentionally leave them out?
That's a great question. And what I'll say is what we're doing here is one, if we're doing an exhibit experience, really understanding who our primary audiences will be for that exhibit. Will it be an exhibit catered more towards a more tech savvy generation? Or is this a topic that, this is senior citizen territory, so we need to be cognizant of that? Um, Also, the volume of people we're expecting to get. And so there's a lot of sort of market research. So, yes, businesses and museums as well, but a lot of market research that goes into what will this exhibit do outside of sharing this particular story? How will it impact our overall interpretation, the stories we tell, etc. From there, I hate to say it, but budget. One of the biggest factors on can we include this really cool thing or not is will we get someone to pay for it? And what I would say to anyone on this call, especially if you work at a major corporation, the more immersive and engaging you want an experience to be, the more it's going to cost. So you have to invest in that. And a lot of times, we just took down an exhibit where we had some really cool ideas on how to talk about opera makeup and putting filters up so you could put on like Aida makeup or Turandot makeup. And no sponsors bid at it. So we had to cut it from the exhibit. So really knowing your audience, really knowing your budget and who would support it, but also finding that balance between everything else in your institution. If you have 5 galleries and 3 of them are just really, really digitally immersive, maybe you have a photography exhibit that's just the pictures so that people have that space to kind of decompress from all the digital screens or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Uh, I guess I always like the conversations when you get lots of like really smart people in the room who know museums, passionate about museums, have lots of very varied experiences in museums, and then pulling together that curation of an experience where, yeah, in this corner there's a giant touchscreen display and you build and invent your own dinosaur inside the dueling dinosaurs lab, but then you actually, I don't, you think about the spaces here that we've just opened, you walk in and you're just in the lab and there's a
Yeah.
person that's at the table who's a paleontologist and they talk to you and it's face-to-face interactions, uh, and then and then a 3D printed dinosaur fossil that you get to pick up and handle, like all of those different things that come together that really make museum experiences I think, profound and influential for people across all stages of life.
Yeah, and that kid will probably have that 3D printed fossil for the rest of their lives, or at least a big chunk of it, because it'll be when I was 8, I got to make this Triceratops fossil. Look at me. And you'll have gone on to your career, retired and living on the beach, but that person has been touched forever by that one experience in your institution. And I think that's something that technology can really help us create more moments like that.
Let me grab another one from the chat for you. Michael wants to know, how will you be using technology in your America 250 programming and exhibits?
Wow, Michael, I am so glad that you asked.
Wait, do you know Michael Sagar? Because maybe this is a planted question.
So I actually do know Michael, but I didn't know he was going to be asking that question. But so we have actually contracted with a company called Histovery. They're like the Rolls Royce of exhibit design firms. For context, they completely redid the Alamo. They also did the Notre Dame exhibit when Notre Dame burned so that you could still enter Notre Dame. And our entire first floor is going to be all things Rev War. So one side will focus on just like the war at a high level, yay, America. And then the other side will focus just on the Carolinas and our role and how the war was won in the South. And with those histopads that I showed in my presentation, not only will they get to have interactive elements through the histopad, there are games for children, there's trivia, there are scavenger hunts, there are kind of selfie frames that you can take at different objects in different places throughout the exhibit. And then the histopad / really fancy iPad will email it to you so that you can have a copy for yourself. Again, it will show 1775 Charlotte versus Charlotte throughout the years. And then we're working with them so that you can take the histopad into our historic house. You see what it looks like today, but how would it have looked like when the different families who have lived in this structure lived here? So the furniture from 1774 is going to be different from the furniture from 1850, is going to be different from the furniture in the 1940s, and is definitely different from where it is today. So this exhibit, we have a 6-hour radius of exclusivity. If you want to see it and you're within 6 hours of Charlotte, you're going to have to come to us to see it. But we're excited to, one, create that immersive experience throughout the exhibit, but two, use the technology to push people out to other sites within that 6-hour radius. If you come and you just really want to hear more about the Battle of Kings Mountain, there are no better people to talk about it than the people at the Battle of Kings Mountain. So driving people out to our brother and sister institutions will also be a part of the technology. Thanks for asking, Michael.
Great question. All right, next one for you. What is your vision, or where do you see the Charlotte Museum of History in 5 years?
That's
knocking down the Heinz History Center from their perch.
Yes, taking the Heinz History Center down. I joke with them and say, I'm coming for you. I know how you make your sausage, so it's okay. On a serious tip for Charlotte Museum of History, our biggest thing is just kind of reminding people that we are here. We have survived decades of adversity, and you're going to have to kill me for us not to survive this current phase. And I would prefer not to die. So thanks in advance. I see us completing our restoration of the 1774 Rock House that we won a MPS grant for, and creating a more immersive experience. We don't want to have a historic house that is just, oh, look at all the old stuff, and then you walk out. We really want people to feel the history of this structure and not in a worshipful sort of way. We were always supposed to have an annex built. I'd love to have that annex break ground within 5 years. It didn't get built because of that recession that drove me to museums in the first place. And there are some other smaller institutions in the city that we've had conversations with that have historic structures that united, we think we would be a stronger historical entity for people in the Piedmont than as smaller little city states scattered throughout. So more immersive exhibits, fully restored and more in interactive historic structures, and breaking ground on the annex that we should have had 20 years ago, but we're going to build now.
That's an impressive list.
Fingers crossed.
We're cheering for you.
Thanks.
We're rooting for you. And maybe somebody on this call will fund it. Next question for you. Can you talk more about the importance of art and photography for telling your story? You've mentioned art and photography actually regularly throughout the talk.
I have. So many people, I think most of us know that people learn through different ways best. Some people are hands-on tactile learners, so that's where like that 3D printing and touchable things in a museum becomes popular. But a lot of people are visual learners. So if you say, Bob John lived in 1813 and he was a farmer, well, what does that mean? Like, it's one thing to go on the internet and say, I'm going to look up Gene Hackman, right? And I can know who Gene Hackman is, even though he's no longer with us. RIP Gene Hackman. But this random person who existed before photography, before film, before, anything outside of oil paintings, which only the very wealthy could afford, how do I picture myself with that person? How can I visualize them? And so one of the things we do is we partner with an organization called Charlotte is Creative, but there are organizations like them everywhere. And we pay market rates for artists and commission art that depicts people or moments throughout Charlotte's history. Um, and we tell them the history, the biography, the context around the exhibit, and we say, now you as an artist in XYZ year, you take this and you create an image that you think represents this. And it started off as a one-off project, but is now an annual thing for us. We commission 3 to 4 pieces of art that we're seeing all sorts of artistic styles. The artist's interpretation of the history is really eye-opening for us, how they choose to represent different people throughout history. It's created a very unique program that is provocative because it's talking about historical people from our region, but the artistic interpretation of their lives and what that means to that person kind of adds a layer of humanity to them that just reading their name on a plaque otherwise wouldn't.
Wow, that's amazing. I love everything about that.
Come on and see them. They're up right now.
Oh wow, yeah. That's Charlotte is in my plans in the very near future to come and visit, so I might have to update the itinerary.
Absolutely. We'd love to have you.
All right. Well, it looks like we are just about out of our time here today.
Oh.
Terri, can you remind us all how people can follow what you've got going on, or how people could get involved, and how they can, if they want some of these resources that you've mentioned, where they can get access?
Absolutely. Well, if you want to see what Charlotte Museum of History is up to, we are on all social media. Most of them are at Charlotte Museum of History. Probably our Instagram would be the best one to kind of serve as that gateway to everything else. You can also join our mailing list. We send out newsletters twice a week, and those have everything from grants for 3D printers to how you can volunteer to our fun preservation events coming up. If you want some of the resources that I was mentioning, feel free to email me, Terri, Terri, at charlottemuseum.org. I'm going to be honest, don't expect an immediate response, but I will respond. And I'd just love to hear from you guys. How are you incorporating technology into your spaces? And how do you think that we as museums can do a better job? Again, we are here to serve and educate the public. And if we're doing something that's really lame, or you have an idea that's really cool, I'd love to hear it and just kind of see what the public is interested in.
And I love that doing all of that can also be this pipeline for people to get into the museum sector through whatever
Absolutely.
their individual passions or career choices might be. Like that was
If
such a big theme of your presentation for me too, that
there is no career that is out there that you cannot find a museum job in, be it law, science, engineering, communications, art. If you do it and you want to work in a museum, there's a museum that is out there for you that would love your skills.
well, Terri, thanks for being with us today. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you, everyone who joined us.
Yeah, everybody, thanks for being here. Thanks for tuning in for the Lunchtime Discovery series. Of course, we will be back here again next Wednesday at noon with another great edition of the program for you. Next week, we're going to be talking with the executive director of Tryon Palace, Crystal Regan. Crystal will actually be here in person in downtown Raleigh at the Museum of Natural Sciences. So seating is limited. I suggest you get here early. Feel free to bring your lunch with you to sit inside the theater to check out. It is the Lunchtime Discovery series, by the way. So don't miss out. That's going to be fantastic. And of course, next Wednesday is a reschedule from the talk that we had to cancel back in February because of the snow days. So we are highly anticipating having Crystal here in the Globe. But of course, we'll also be here live on the museum's YouTube channel. So wherever you're at, I hope that you can join us next week. Tune in. Make sure that you're following the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education. They're at North Carolina EE on social media, and you can get details about this program and more that they've got going on at their website, eenorthcarolina.org. And of course, as always, you can follow the Museum of Natural Sciences on social. You can hit up our website, naturalsciences.org, and all of this information is there too. We put it everywhere. That way everybody could find it. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday afternoon, the rest of your week. Be safe, be kind. We'll see you again next time. Bye, folks.